In the shining heart of Athens, where philosophers debated ethics and the arts flourished, a hidden darkness thrived, one that supported the very foundation of Greek civilization. While poets sang of beauty and democracy, thousands of people lived under chains, silenced by a society that spoke of reason yet practiced brutal control. This contradiction, the celebration of human excellence alongside the quiet normalization of human suffering, was not accidental. It was essential. Ancient Greece is often remembered as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and the Olympic Games. Yet behind this celebrated curtain was a social order built on extreme exploitation. Every stone of the Parthenon, every play performed in the theater of Dionysus, every scroll in the library of Aristotle was made possible by slaves. These were men, women, and children, foreign captives, debtors, and even Greeks themselves, reduced to tools of labor. The Greeks didn't merely tolerate slavery, they institutionalized it. Slavery was not just present. It was embedded into their laws, economics, and family structures. A free Athenian citizen could proudly discuss virtue and freedom while his household functioned on the backs of enslaved workers. There was no shame in owning a human being. In fact, wealth and social status were often measured by how many slaves one owned. What is most disturbing is not just that slavery existed, but how it was justified. Philosophers like Aristotle classified certain people as natural slaves, arguing that some were born to rule while others were born to obey. This was not fringe thinking. It was mainstream ideology, allowed the society to sleep peacefully, untroubled by the moral consequences of brutality, because they truly believed their system was natural, even noble. In homes, slaves were cooks, cleaners, and tutors. On farms, they harvested olives and grapes under the scorching sun. In mines, they labored in deadly silence, often chained, suffocating in toxic air. In brothels, they were stripped of every ounce of humanity. These weren't distant, disposable tools. They were the quiet machinery behind everything the Greeks called civilization. And yet, their stories are nearly invisible in historical records. Slaves did not leave behind journals or letters. Their thoughts, feelings, and identities were rarely documented. What we know comes mostly from the writings of the very people who oppressed them, sometimes in passing, as though mentioning a piece of furniture. The contradiction is unbearable. Society that gave us the concept of democracy, while simultaneously normalizing one of the most dehumanizing systems imaginable. Greek philosophers spoke of logos, rational thought, but denied that same rationality to those they enslaved. Their temples stood tall, praising gods like Athena, goddess of wisdom, while wisdom itself was denied to the people who cleaned the temple floors. This chapter is not just about uncovering what happened, it's about questioning what we choose to remember. It challenges the clean, romanticized version of history often painted in textbooks and museums. Because behind the glorious marble columns and golden myths of ancient Greece, there was blood, pain, and silence. It is time we heard it. Long before the grandeur of Athens reached its peak, the roots of slavery in Greece were already firmly planted. The system did not emerge suddenly. It evolved over centuries, shaped by war, colonization, trade, and greed. In the earliest Greek, city-states like Mycenae and Spartan enslavement was both a practical tool and a political weapon. Slavery in Greece was first driven by war. Victors did not just seize land, they seized people. Men were chained for labor, while women and children were sold into homes or worse. Foreigners captured in conflict were branded as outsiders, their lack of Greek language and customs used as justification for lifelong bondage. The term barbaros wasn't just an insult, it was a dividing line between who could be free and who was fated to be owned. The expansion of Greek colonies across the Mediterranean intensified the slave trade. Coastal raids, piracy, and alliances with local tribes ensured a steady flow of captives. These humans were then sold in bustling slave markets in cities like Corinth and Delos, where buyers examined them like livestock, checking teeth, muscles, and obedience. slavery also grew from within. In hard times, debt could become a trap. Poor citizens who couldn't pay back loans sometimes sold themselves or their children into servitude. This domestic enslavement blurred the lines between freedom and captivity. A man might live next door to his enslaved brother, now owned by another citizen. But beyond brute economics, slavery was deeply embedded in the Greek worldview. Unlike later Western societies that cloaked slavery in religion or race, the Greeks made it a philosophical and social necessity. In their eyes, civilization required a leisure class of citizens who had time to debate, vote, and sculpt ideals. Slavery provided that leisure by handling the dirty work. The polis, or city-state, could not function without it. Every part of urban life, from food production and construction to childcare and religious rituals relied on slave labor. Enslaved people were expected to remain invisible, their voices erased from the democratic theater that glorified freedom. For the few, Sparta, the militant city-state, took slavery to a terrifying extreme. The Spartans didn't just own slaves. They created a whole caste of people called helots, who were state-owned and brutally oppressed. Elites lived under constant surveillance, forced to farm and feed the Spartan war machine while enduring ritual humiliation, public beatings, and even state-sanctioned murder. Despite their suffering, slaves were considered property, not people. They could not legally marry, own land, or testify in court unless tortured. Slaves' humanity was not just ignored, it was actively stripped away by law and culture. Those who resisted paid a heavy price, flogging, mutilation, or death even. The sacred spaces of Greece were not safe from this system. Temples were built by slaves. Offerings to the gods were made possible by their labor. In Delphi, the oracle spoke of fate and destiny, never for the enslaved. The divine order was silent about their suffering. What's most haunting is how normalized it all was. There were no abolitionist movements, no recorded protests. Slavery was so ingrained in society that even kind-hearted citizens never questioned. It was seen not as evil, but as inevitable. The foundation of Greek greatness, then, was laid in chains. And before we can celebrate what they gave the world, we must confront what they took from so many others. Inside the ancient Greek home beyond, the marble columns and ornate mosaic savory continued. Slavery continued, hidden from the public eye, but no less brutal. These were not slaves in chains under the sun. These were household slaves, serving silently under roofs they did not own, bound not by iron, but by routine fear and utter dependence. Every respectable Athenian household, regardless of size, had at least one slave. Wealthier families often had dozens each with a designated role. There were cooks, maids, tutors, gardeners, wet nurses, and even doormen. These slaves woke before their masters and retired only after their needs were satisfied. They prepared meals they would never taste, cleaned rooms they weren't allowed to rest in, and raised children they could never claim as their own. Many household slaves were women and children. The women were often treated as both laborers and tools of convenience, expected to serve the master's family during the day and submit to his desires at night. Young female slaves were particularly vulnerable, caught in a cycle of abuse that was normalized under Greek domestic customs. Their trauma rarely left the walls of the home and never reached the laws outside. Male slaves, on the other hand, were sometimes educated and even trained for specific tasks. Wealthy households might own a pedagogue, a male slave who educated and disciplined the children. These slaves, often more intelligent than their owners, lived in a constant contradiction, shaping the minds of free Greek citizens while having no freedom of their own. Despite their roles in maintaining daily life, household slaves had no legal personhood. Their punishments were not just harsh, they were dehumanizing. If a master was dissatisfied, he could beat, brand, starve, or sell a slave with no legal consequence. There was no protection from cruelty, only the whims of the household. It's tempting to imagine that those who lived indoors were better off than the laborers in mines or fields. But in truth, domestic slavery was its own form of psychological imprisonment. The constant proximity to comfort, freedom, and family created an emotional torture. These enslaved individuals were reminded daily of what they were not allowed to. Have they slept on stone floors next to gilded furniture? They cooked banquets they could never taste? They rocked noble babies to sleep while longing for children they might have been forced to abandon. Privacy didn't exist for these slaves. Every corner of the house was their workplace, and every hour was owned. Even religious rituals within the home required their presence, yet they were excluded from praying as equals. Slaves might help prepare offerings to the household gods, but they themselves were seen as offerings to the system. Sometimes, these house slaves developed deep bonds with the children they raised, but even those relationships were never safe. As boys grew into men, they often learned to see the very slaves who nurtured them as inferior. Respect dissolved into entitlement. Kindness was replaced with control, and should a household fall into debt, its slaves were the first to be sold. No history, no memory, no bonds could save them. They could be torn from their surrogate families overnight, sent to harsher owners, harsher work, or harsher places. In a society that celebrated the domestic as sacred, the suffering within the home was among the most quietly devastating. The household, so often painted in ancient Greek literature as a place of harmony and honor, was behind its doors a silent theater of servitude, fear, and forgotten lives. Among the darkest aspects of slavery in ancient Greece was the fate of enslaved children. Unlike adults who had known a life before captivity, children born or taken into slavery never had a sense of personal freedom. Their world began with chains and commands. They grew up learning that their worth was measured only by how useful or obedient they could be. To their masters, many of these children were captured during wars or raids and brought to Greece from foreign lands. Others were born to enslaved mothers and immediately inherited their mother's status, ensuring they would never be free. These children were considered property from birth. Their earliest experiences were often filled with labor, fear, and confusion. Young boys were often trained to serve as domestic aides, personal attendants, or entertainers. Some were forced into hard labor even before their bodies were fully developed. They were seen as expendable tools, small, cheap, and easy to control. Their vulnerability made them easy targets for mistreatment. Girls had an even more tragic fate. Enslaved young girls were often assigned to assist in the homes of elite families, performing chores, taking care of noble children, or working in textile rooms. But behind these ordinary tasks lurked darker realities many were subjected to. Physical and emotional abuse, treated as objects rather than human beings. As they grew older, their vulnerability increased. Some were forced into the roles of concubines or sold into brothels, long before they were old enough to understand what was happening to them. There was no childhood for these enslaved youth, no play, no safety, no affection that wasn't transactional. Even kindness from masters or their children was dangerous. It blurred the line between use and care, control and dependency. Any affection shown could vanish the moment the child was no longer seen as useful. Education was rare. Only a handful of enslaved boys were taught to read or write, usually if they were destined to become household tutors or clerks. For most, ignorance was enforced because a child who couldn't read was a child who couldn't question, escape, or resist. And perhaps the most tragic part, enslaved children who grew up inside. Elite homes often developed bonds with the families they served, but these bonds were one-sided. They might see the master's children as siblings or friends, only to be reminded harshly that they were not equal, not loved, not protected. In ancient Greece, youth was idealized in art and literature. But for enslaved children, youth was not a time of beauty or hope. It was a silent, stolen tragedy. Life for slaves in ancient Greece often appeared orderly on the surface, clean homes, polite manners, structured households. But behind those carefully crafted walls lay a darker, hidden world of cruelty. Inside the privacy of Greek homes, slaves especially, women and children were subjected to quiet, consistent brutality. Physical punishment was a regular part of life. Slaves were beaten for mistakes, delays, or even without cause. Masters held absolute power. They didn't answer to the law for what they did within their homes. A broken dish or slow obedience could earn a lashing. Some used sticks, others ropes or heated metal rods. The screams of pain were rarely heard beyond the courtyard walls, and even if they were, no one intervened. It was all considered normal, but physical pain was only part of the suffering. Emotional cruelty was equally devastating. Slaves were often insulted, degraded, and humiliated daily. They were stripped of names, dignity, and identity. Many were given demeaning nicknames instead of being addressed as human beings. In some homes, enslaved women were used as tools of pleasure for their masters, treated not as people, but as possessions for exploitation. There was no escape. Greek society viewed slaves as property, not persons. Their pain was invisible too. The outside world, even philosophers who spoke of justice and virtue, rarely extended those values to slaves within their own homes. The concept of human rights simply didn't exist for the enslaved. Some masters were known for their cruelty, creating a culture of terror where every move a slave made was calculated out of fear. The enslaved never knew when a harsh word might turn into a beating or worse. And the worst part, the violence was not seen as wrong, it was seen as discipline, as control, as a master's right. A few slaves fought back or attempted escape, but the consequences were severe branding, mutilation, or death. Fear was the silent weapon used to maintain order, and it worked. Most remained obedient, not out of loyalty, but out of sheer terror. Behind the whitewashed stone walls of ancient Greece's grand homes, a different reality played out, one built on dominance, fear, and pain. The same society that gave the world ideas of beauty and democracy also built its comfort on the silent cries of the enslaved. Ancient Athens is celebrated as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and intellectual freedom. Great thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle walked its streets. Public debates on justice, truth, and morality echoed through marble halls. Yet beneath this proud image lay a deep contradiction. While Athens spoke of freedom, thrived on slavery. The same philosophers who shaped Western thought accepted slavery as a natural part of life. Aristotle, in his writings, claimed that some people were natural slaves born to serve. He argued that slaves lacked the rational soul that made one fit for freedom. This idea wasn't just accepted, it was embraced by the educated elite. The minds that dreamed of utopia also defended chains, Athenian democracy, which gave citizens a voice, excluded a large portion of the population. Only adult freeborn males could vote. Women, foreigners, and all slaves had no political rights. Ironically, the leisure that allowed Athenian citizens to gather in assemblies or attend philosophical lectures was made possible by the labor of their slaves. Every moment of deep thought was, in a way, bought with someone else's suffering. Socrates asked what it meant to live a good life, yet never challenged the system that relied on forced labor. Plato wrote about ideal societies, but his republic still included enslaved workers. These men questioned the heavens, the soul, and the universe, but rarely questioned their own comfort at the expense of others. The hypocrisy runs deep. Athenian values preached balance and justice, yet their very structure depended on inequality. Slaves cooked their food, cleaned their homes, raised their children, and even accompanied them in battle. Their hands built the monuments and temples Athens is still known for today. But history rarely speaks their names. This contrast between high ideals and harsh realities exposes the double standards of ancient Athens. Their vision of civilization was not for everyone. It was built on exclusion, justified by flawed philosophy, and protected by silence. In the glow of wisdom and art, darker truth lingered. The Enlightenment of Athens was lit by the labor of the enslaved. In ancient Greece, women had little freedom, but enslaved women had even less. Their lives were controlled not only by the system of slavery, but also by a deeply patriarchal society that viewed them as property. These women were often silenced, once by their status, and again by their gender. Enslaved women performed the most intimate and demanding tasks in Greek households. They cooked meals, cleaned floors, fetched water, raised the children, and managed the daily needs of their masters. But unlike free women, who were expected to stay secluded, enslaved women were constantly visible, serving, bending, obeying. Their labor extended far beyond physical work. Many enslaved women were forced into sexual servitude. In homes, were treated as objects for male pleasure, often passed from one man to another, with no say in their fate. In brothels, their exploitation was openly commercialized. These brothels were not secret, shameful places. They were legal businesses that lined the streets of Greek cities. It was a brutal irony. While free women were expected to remain pure and hidden, enslaved women were exposed, violated, and used to fulfill the desires society could not place on its own daughters. The double standard was sharp and cruel. A woman's body was judged not by her humanity, but by her status free or enslaved. Even young girls were not spared. Enslaved girls were raised to serve, often given to households at a very early age. Many were born into slavery, never knowing what freedom even meant. Some were trained as domestic companions. Others were groomed for prostitution. Despite their suffering, these women formed quiet bonds with one another. In some cases, enslaved women cared for each other's children or found strength in shared pain. But their voices were rarely recorded, and history has largely erased their names. In Greek art and literature, these women appear only as shadows, anonymous, servants in the background of a banquet, or voiceless figures in the corner of a painting. Yet their presence was constant, and their impact was immense. They carried burdens in silence. They built families while denied their own. They lived in a society that saw them as tools, not as people. They endured. In ancient Greece, war didn't just bring glory, it brought slaves. Every conquest filled the cities with new prisoners, men, women, and children dragged from their homes and forced into lives of servitude. These weren't just enemies defeated. In battle, they became property, sold in markets like livestock. When Greek armies stormed a city, they often gave citizens two options: death or enslavement. Soldiers would round up survivors, tie them in chains, and march them back to their homelands. Once there, they were auctioned off or handed over as rewards. Some ended up in wealthy households, others in fields or mines. A few were forced into public service or even religious roles, always under strict control. This system wasn't hidden, it was celebrated. Statues and inscriptions often praised generals for how many slaves they brought home. The more successful the war, the more slaves a city could sell. Economies boomed on the backs of the defeated. And while many Greeks spoke of honor and freedom, they built their cities with the hands of the enslaved. Even young children were not spared. After a siege, soldiers would take children from their families, sometimes selling them separately. These children grew up never knowing their real names, their cultures erased. Some were trained to serve elite households, others forced into hard labor from the time they could walk. For the Greeks, enslaving their enemies was justified. They believed that non-Greeks, those who didn't speak their language or share their customs, were naturally inferior. To them, conquering and enslaving such people wasn't just acceptable. It was a sign of superiority. But the cruelty of this system ran deep. Slaves taken in war often remembered the horrors of battle, the screams of their families, the fires that destroyed their homes. Many never recovered from the trauma. Some tried to escape, but most had no choice but to submit. The silence of these captives echoes through history. While victors wrote poems and carved monuments, the conquered were forgotten. Their stories buried with them. Behind every triumphal arch and marble statue in Greece, there are ghosts and seen hands that built the temples, cleaned the streets, raised the children of their conquerors. They were not part of the celebration, only the aftermath. As time swept forward, the grand temples of Athens remained. The philosophies of Plato endured, and the myths of gods echoed through generations. But the voices of the enslaved millions who lived, suffered, and died in silence were lost too. Ancient Greek writers rarely recorded the experiences of slaves. Their stories weren't considered worth preserving. Instead, what survives are fragments, brief mentions in comedies, passing comments in political debates, or legal records that strip away humanity. The result: gaping silence where thousands of lives should echo. Archaeology has tried to fill the void. Broken shackles, tools worn down by endless use, small shrines hidden in corners of homes, These objects whisper untold stories. They suggest pain, endurance, and perhaps even moments of hope. But no names, no biographies. The individual slave disappears into the crowd. It's not that they didn't matter, it's that they were never meant to be remembered. Greek society thrived on forgetting them. Citizens spoke proudly of democracy, yet excluded the enslaved from every right. The glories of Athens were built not only on ideas, but on backs bent under unending labor. Even modern education often skips over this truth. When students learn of ancient Greece, they hear of Aristotle, not the servant who washed his robes. They hear of epic poetry, not the enslaved scribe who copied verses until his hands bled. The story of Greece is told as if freedom were the rule but for nearly half the population. It was never a possibility. Still today, historians and scholars are beginning to listen for these lost voices. Through careful study of overlooked records and material remnants, a clearer picture begins to emerge. It is still incomplete, still quiet, but it's growing louder. And perhaps that is the most important legacy of all. The recognition that history is not just the tale of